about socio-technical transitions, which are large-scale shifts in energy, food, mobility systems. So I'll be talking, first give an introduction, then I'll briefly introduce the multi-level perspective. Then I'll illustrate it with a comparative case study of the energy transition in Germany and the UK. And the main point will be that, of course, they have similar technologies, but the kind of choices they make in terms of the actors that are driving it, the institutions, lead to very different kind of transition pathways. And then I'll make some concluding remarks at the end. I've also been approached beforehand by the Divest Princeton campaign to express my support, which I'm very happy to do. It seems a very worthwhile endeavor. I've also signed the online petition. So the background of this, there's a whole new discourse on transitions, not just in academia, but also in policy. Of course, the background, as you all know, is that since the last 2 decades, we're facing new environmental problems, which are only set to become worse in the coming decades: climate change, biodiversity, resource problems. And these are different from the environmental problems in the 60s and 70s, which were much more local. These are now global. They're wicked problems. There's no single cause. They're anchored in deep societal structures and systems. So that's the reason why these problems can no longer be solved with just end-of-pipe technologies, why there is an increasing interest in not just incremental change, but really change to new kind of systems: energy, transport, food, housing. These are some of the main drivers. So the novelty of this approach is to not just talk about the economy, as economists, they tend to talk about, the carbon price is solving everything, which remains important. I'm not against the carbon price, but I think the importance of this system transition focus is that it focuses not just on nature or the economy, which is more the interface between in this picture below, but it really focuses on the core drivers of environmental problems, which is, of course, the demand for all kind of resources to meet societal functions in energy, food, mobility, housing. So that's the reason, the underlying reason there are new problems, new environmental problems, which leads to new debates about the kind of solutions. This is really being picked up very widely in all kind of policy reports. The UK has a low carbon transition plan from 2009 already. There's an OECD report from 2015 on system innovation. And the European Commission has got this Energy Union package from 2015, which envisages transitions in all these different sectors: power, industry, transport. Of course, the IPCC report 2018 really explicitly talks about system transitions, again in the same kind of systems: food, infrastructure, energy, mobility. The European Environment Agency 2016 has taken this on board: sustainability transitions. There's another report from 2019 which talks about policy and practice. And of course, the European Green Deal, which was launched in 2019, is still being implemented, also talks about system transitions in similar systems such as energy, buildings, food, to address the various environmental problems. So there's a really broad discourse, and the whole discourse of transitions is quite new, I think, for policymakers. They tend to prefer to talk more about incremental changes. So the fact that they now talk about these large-scale systemic changes really opens up a new window of opportunity for us academics also to bring in new ideas and new ways of thinking about the problem. So how then do I frame the problem of transitions? I look at socio-technical systems. So I start with what kind of societal functions do we have and what is needed to fulfill those. So this can be mobility, it can be sustenance, it can be shelter. And then to fulfill those societal functions, you need socio-technical systems. And these include sectors and industries, which is the more traditional economic way of looking at the world, but they also include use and cultural, political meaning. So this is an example of the transport system, where, of course, in most countries, car transport is dominant. So the car is at the bottom. But for the car to function, you need a fuel infrastructure, you need markets, and we've embedded the car in our lifestyles. There's an industry structure behind it. There's a repair and maintenance network. There are regulations, there's a road infrastructure, and there are cultural meanings that stabilize the car. And it's all these elements together that of course make the car system so entrenched and so difficult to change. Of course, behind these different elements of socio-technical systems, you can identify different social groups. Companies are central, industry that produce things, but also users, societal groups, different levels of policymakers, the supply chain, researchers. Of course, the precise configuration of this organizational field is a bit different for food than it is for energy, than it is for mobility. But these are some of the main societal groups. And of course, the issue of a transition is they all have different interests, capabilities, viewpoints of the world, and how they respond to each other and how they interact with each other is a really important element of understanding big transitions. So that's how I frame the topic, what we need to understand, how these big socio-technical systems with all these kind of different groups, how that changes over time. So I'm speaking from this whole new research community has emerged since the 2000s. It's so far, it's an international network. It's about 2,000 plus members. Anyone can join with annual conferences. It's linked to a journal. And it's become quite a big community now, which publishes about 500 papers a year and lots of citations. And so this is the kind of framework or the kind of community that I'm coming from. My own background is more from innovation studies, but this research community has become increasingly interdisciplinary. So political science, evolutionary economics, business studies, cultural studies. Of course, there are different other schools of thought have looked at large-scale transformation or transition. The terms are often used intermittently. So you've got the socio-economic school, socio-ecological transformations, and then the socio-technical. They've got slightly different assumptions of how the world works. Nevertheless, they have similar views about the phenomenological characteristics of transition processes as not being driven by single causes, but as co-evolutionary processes which are full of complexity, this emergence of novelty and therefore also uncertainties and non-linearities and trade-offs. So it's a nice batch of words, and I'll try to make it a bit more concrete, speaking mostly from a socio-technical perspective. So just one slide on the theoretical background before I actually start explaining the theoretical framework. It is interdisciplinary. The whole field of sustainability transitions is really interdisciplinary, but the socio-technical transitions point of view primarily emerge from four theories. That's evolutionary economics, where of course Schumpeter has for a long time talked about waves of destruction and radical innovation and how this leads to overthrow and disruption and transitions. But evolutionary economists tend to take the market for given as if it just exists. They don't really look at policy and have a quite simple view of consumers. So sociology of innovation, which is Wiebe Bijker and Michel Carlon, they see innovation not just as R&D, but also as social networks, knowledge flows, interpretations of the various actors. Institutional theory is important because transitions inevitably will also mean changes in the various policies and institutions that underpin markets. And I also draw on history, not just because of empirical cases, but also their theory of change. More recently, there's also been increasing efforts to introduce insights from political science, discourse theory, and business and management. So I've got a few slides, I think 6 or 7, on the multi-level perspective to just outline the basic view of change. And to start with, I'm interested in the meso level here, the existing system, which I outlined before, the socio-technical system and the various actors behind it. That's the meso level I'm interested in. And then what we know from evolutionary economics is that the radical innovations, and radical I define as deviating from the existing regime in one or more dimensions, which can be technologically new, can also be social innovation or business model innovation. They tend to emerge in peripheral niches. So not in the mainstream. It's usually peripheral actors, outsiders that develop new ideas. That's at the bottom level here in this picture. These niche innovations then try to diffuse, but they really face uphill struggles against this deeply entrenched system. And then we also distinguish a broader, what we call a landscape, but it's basically just a garbage can concept at the moment, for exogenous trends. As I said, I won't go through this slide in any depth, but in all the main systems, mobility, agro-food, energy, there are already a range of seeds or radical innovations, if you will, which are technical innovations, but can also be social or grassroots innovations, business model innovations, and infrastructural innovations. So, for example, in mobility, we've got, of course, the battery electric vehicles, the biofuel cars, the hydrogen cars. But you also have the more grassroots or social innovations, car sharing, bike clubs, modal shift, teleworking, teleconferencing. And then, of course, there's business model innovations, mobility services, and all the apps, smart mobility apps, bike sharing, and then the idea of compact cities. So in all of these systems, we have different kind of innovations. But the problem is they tend to emerge in these niches, and they tend to remain quite small because they really face these uphill struggles against the existing systems. And these existing systems, they've been around for a long time in many Western countries since the Second World War or even before. So there's a huge literature that distinguishes different kind of lock-in mechanisms or path dependence mechanisms. These can be economic. So the existing technology is much cheaper, it's better, it has scale advantages. And there may also be sunk investments in skills, factories, and infrastructure. The social and organizational lock-in mechanisms, which relate to the capabilities or the vested interests, but also user practices and lifestyles. And obviously a third kind of explanatory factor is the political lock-in mechanisms. It's an uneven playing field, often between the incumbents and the new entrants. And the vested interests tend to have much more access to policymakers to change the institutions to their liking. So there's a range of explanatory factors of why change is so difficult to come about. Nevertheless, we know in all these systems, and I've just shown some examples, there are these radical innovations, which Joel Mokyr, who's a historian, he calls them hopeful monstrosities. So they're hopeful because they do something new that the existing technology or innovation cannot do. But in the beginning, they're also monstrous in the sense that their price is, they're really costly and they don't work very well. So if you look in the past at the first computers or the first cars or the first internet, it did not work very well. And it took a long time for the technology to improve, for costs to come down, for things to get better. So that's why radical innovations cannot immediately compete against in the mainstream market against the existing systems. And that's why they really are emerging in these protected spaces, which we call niches. And of course, this is an idea from evolutionary economics. So they're often developed by entrepreneurs, by outsiders, small social networks who spend time and effort, often for decades, to improve the innovation. So these are just some examples from the past about how long it can take from the first idea, which is the invention, to the first innovation, which is the market introduction. The computers is an exceptional example because this was developed during the Second World War when there were lots of resources thrown at this technology, and it was only developed in 4 years' time. But most of the technologies here take between 20, 30, 40 years to develop from the first ideas to actual market introduction. So that's quite a long time for this niche innovation period. And the third level is this wider landscape, which sort of creates these gradients of force that the transitions have to navigate. And as I said earlier, this is at the moment mostly a garbage can concept to acknowledge that there is an external context which is likely to change. You know, if you're looking at 20, 30, 40-year processes, it's very unlikely that the wider context is going to stay the same. So we look both at slow changing trends, which can be demographics, macroeconomics, ideology, but also shocks. All shocks have been important in the past, and wars and recessions. And of course, now we are still exploring what the effect is going to be of the pandemic. So if you put these three levels together, then this is the multi-level perspective that I have helped to develop to try to understand the basic outlines of how transitions happen. So again, we're interested in the meso level, how the changes happen there. And the arrows in the middle represent that the existing systems are not completely inert, but usually develop through incremental change. Then at the bottom, that's where the radical innovations emerge, But in the beginning, this is represented with these small little arrows. There's lots of disagreement between the actors about where to go. There may be multiple design options. There's lots of trial and error. Things don't work out. There's lots of experiments and projects. It's learning by doing. In the beginning, things don't work very well. You need sequences of these projects to gradually try to work out what works. And this picture, that applies to all the radical innovations, which I showed in the earlier, from the radar to internet to internal combustion engines. Then in the second phase, the innovations gradually begin to stabilize. There's more agreement about where to go. There's dominant design emerging. Companies can invest more. There's slightly more certainty about where to go. Visions are becoming clearer. But then, of course, they are also moving into really small market niches, so they gain a slight foothold in the market. But they're still facing this uphill struggle against this existing system. So in the third phase, it requires not only the internal dynamics, increasing returns to adoption or stronger investments or price performance improvements, not only those endogenous dynamics, but it also very often requires external pressures on this existing system, which is the arrow from the landscape, which then create tensions and problems in the existing system and leads to it opening up. And those windows of opportunity then provide the opportunity for the niche innovation to break through, replace the system, and have all kind of knock-on effects. So that's the basic view of how transitions take place. They take place over multiple phases, driven by different actors and different kind of mechanisms. But it's clear in most cases you have these struggles on the different dimensions, a struggle between new entrants and incumbents, economic struggles between the gray and the green technologies, political struggles between incumbent elites and new actors, which can be cities, social movements, but also green entrepreneurs. And very often there's also a cultural struggle about the meaning given to the old and to the new. So that's all I wanted to say for the moment about the theoretical framework. If you have more questions, we can talk about this later. And I've got about 10 minutes, I think, to talk about this empirical case study, which is meant to illustrate the basic outlines of this view of looking at change. This is the title of the paper, where it is described in more detail. So Germany and the UK both have experienced quite substantial growth of renewables since the 1990s, when the renewables were very small, 2% in the UK and 4% in Germany. They've grown substantially over the last 30 years. And the renewables in Germany are now 40.4%, in the UK 33% in 2018. So if you look at this graph, it looks pretty similar, except that Germany had a sort of a head start, but otherwise it looks like quite a similar kind of transition unfolding in both countries. However, if you look a bit more detailed about the kind of technologies that are being used in both countries, you see quite different patterns. So in Germany, they chose mostly small-scale options. So they have a lot of onshore wind, is the biggest diffusion curve, but most of the turbines are relatively small. The wind parks, most of them are smaller than 10 megawatts. Biogas, mostly by farmers, has also really grown quite rapidly. And solar PV, of course, is the big surprise that also the Germans didn't anticipate. Quite marginal until recently has been offshore wind, co-firing, and landfill gas. If we then look at the UK, it's quite a different story. Some of the technologies are the same. Onshore wind is the biggest in the UK, but in the UK, it's mostly large-scale wind parks operated by utilities. Offshore wind has been the big success in the last 5 years in particular, and big biomass is the other really rapidly growing option. And this is mostly about converted coal-fired power plants. So both countries, of course, could potentially use the same kind of technologies. So the question is, why have they chosen such different deployment patterns, and who's driving this? So to analyze it, I'll use this multi-level perspective. I'll have one slide on each of these bullets. Who are the actors behind the niche innovations? What were the institutions and the policy instruments to drive the niche innovations? Then looking at the regimes, what technologies do they have, and what are the coalitions between the incumbent actors, and what is the wider landscape context? So who are the actors driving these renewable energy technologies in both countries? As I already hinted, in the UK, it's mostly incumbent actors, utilities, project developers, landfill site operators that do the biogas and the landfill gas, and power plant operators. There is a little bit of community energy and a little bit of small solar PV on people's homes, but that's really marginal compared to how much money and deployments is coming from the incumbent actors. This contrasts very markedly with Germany, where most of the renewables are deployed by new entrants. Citizens, activists, farmers, cooperative, municipal utilities, and banks. In the table here below, I won't go through it in any details. You see the different technologies, wind, biogas, biomass, and solar PV, and which of the actors. This is a graph, a table from 2010, so it's a little bit outdated. But it still shows the pattern that it's not the big players. You know, the big utilities have really small shares in all the technologies. So that's quite a different deployment pattern between the two countries. If you then look at the policy instruments, this is, of course, that those different actors partly relate to the institutions and the policies that were used. In Germany, we see quite stable financial and regulatory support. The feed-in law in 1990 and then the Renewable Energy Act in 2000, they really created quite generous financial support, the feed-in tariff in particular, for new entrants. And not just attractive, but also stable. This was guaranteed income that you would have for the next 20 years. So that really enables new companies, new entrants to move into the markets and to cope with the uncertainties, because the uncertainties have been diminished by the policy. This really contrasts with the UK, which has which also had financial instruments, but had a much more fluctuating policy. So every 5 years or so, the policies were changed. So you see the names of these policies below: the non-fossil fuels obligation, the renewables obligation, amended renewables obligation, and then contracts for difference. Not only did there was a lots of uncertainty in changing the policies every 4, 5, 6 years, but also the type of instruments was much more about auctions and trading. So that means it's not guaranteed what will be the income. You actually, of course, the idea was neoliberally inspired, that if you have companies bidding, that this will drive down the cost, and you will, as a policymaker, pay the lowest amount of money. But that also means it's uncertain how much money you're going to get from this policy instrument, and that this was particularly problematic for any of these new entrants. You really need to have deep financial pockets in order to deal with the uncertainty, and also you had to have a lot of administrative capability to fill in all the forms and to deal with the complicated instruments. So the type of instruments really favored one actor over another in both countries. Then if we look at the regime technologies and the coalitions, in Germany we see almost this archetypical pattern of incumbent technologies going down and the new ones going up. So the orange, that's the renewables, and this graph ends in 2014, but it has been going up further and further. So that's the one that's been going up, and this is then competing and substituting basically the existing technologies. So coal, hard coal in particular, which is the green curve, was already going down. You also see nuclear energy, which is the red curve, was already going down before 2011. So 2011 was, of course, the Fukushima accident, which in Germany, because of all kind of political context at the time, in Germany, the Fukushima accident led to the decision to phase out nuclear power. So then the red line is going down even further. So Germany almost has this archetypical of the new going up and the old going down. This, of course, created huge financial problems for the big utilities. On the left-hand side here, you see the share price of the big utilities: E.ON, RWE, Vattenfall, which is a Swedish company but operating in Germany. All of them went down massively, the share price, and the income as well. So this really led to a debate about these companies are too big to fail. And although the government had stimulated the transition initially, they really tried to slow it down from about 2012 onwards because they were too fearful that the incumbents were unable to cope. This is quite a different pattern in the UK, where we also do see the renewables rising, but it's much more an initial pattern of coal being replaced with a dash for gas in the 1990s, then price fluctuation, price competition between gas and coal, and then really from 2012 onwards, coal really being phased out very rapidly, and the renewables going upwards. But the government still has very strong plans to support the existing regime players. They had these big plans of building 8 new nuclear power plants, which benefits the incumbents, although they're struggling to finance it, and they have so far only succeeded in getting one as being built. Natural gas is being expanded and coal is being phased out. But overall, the pattern in the UK is much more about working with incumbents, whereas in Germany, it's much more about unleashing new entrants. So then if I go to the coalition, really the actors, in the UK, it's been quite a stable coalition between the government and the utilities. Of course, there have been tensions about specific policies and in particular technology, but overall it's been quite a stable coalition with a tendency to negotiate and to discuss how to move forward, which then leads to a gradual transformation of the incumbents. So the incumbents are gradually reorienting their R&D, their strategies, their investments, but they're not being outcompeted, they're not being replaced. It's actually them transforming themselves. Whereas in Germany, we see a different kind of pattern, which is due partly to quite a disruption with the election of the Green Party and the creation of a red-green government, so that's Labour plus the Green Party, which was in power from 1998 to 2005. And particularly the Greens really wanted a clean break with the utilities, and they succeeded in that, and they set in train all kind of strong policies, which was the really strong support for renewables, but already then they started the ideas of a nuclear phase-out. So the coalitions, but the existing coalitions were quite different in both countries, which is another important explanatory variable. So then the last one, if you look at the landscape, the countries basically at a more foundational level also work really differently. So Germany's got a federal political system, which means there's much more local and state level responsibility, which allows to more local initiatives and experimentation. It's a much more corporatist policy styles where the government tends to negotiate with stakeholders rather than ordaining things from the top down. And Germany also culturally has a very strong environmentalist tradition. And the country still has an economic structure with substantial manufacturing capabilities. So they actually could develop a green growth discourse, where particularly in the beginning of the energy transition, it was German companies that were building the solar PV, that were building the wind turbines. So it was not just a green story, let's do low carbon, but at the same time it was an economic growth story, which until 2010 went very well. But then then we got the Chinese invasion, who were just much cheaper solar PV in particular, and they outcompeted the German manufacturers, which really disrupted this green growth story. So in the UK, we've got a different kind of political system, which is the Westminster system, which is very much closed around Westminster, and it doesn't provide any space or much space for new entrants to talk to the policymakers. It's much more privileged towards working with incumbents. So the big players have access to policymakers, but not the new entrants. It's got a neoliberal ideology in the UK, which privileges these market-based policy instruments and therefore helps to explain the kind of the institutions and the policy instruments that were chosen. It's got a weaker environmental tradition, a very small Green Party, and also the UK has lost much of its manufacturing capabilities. So it couldn't quite benefit to the same degree from a green growth story as the UK did. So these two macro differences are also helping to explain why Germany was more enabling and supporting for new entrants, whereas the UK was much more a pattern of the incumbents being benefited. So working towards the conclusions, as I already said, there are different deployment patterns. Germany much more small scale, enacted by new entrants, with support of niche policies and a favorable landscape context. But the UK has got a different kind of pattern, which is much more large scale and is enacted by the incumbents, which are supported by quite favorable policies.